refresh your memory a little bit, remember that when we're going through Jude, all of these things that are being spoken about now, he's speaking to the church, which is a faithful church, but he's speaking about heretics. So we have to look at how these verses apply to the heretics, and especially tonight we're going to see that. And the other thing also that we're getting into now is that the heretics were not only into a lascivious lifestyle, but the heretics basically just had no restraint on them. Last week we did verse 9, and if you remember, Michael the archangel was restrained from making certain pronouncements to Satan. And the reason there we found it was a court setting, and Michael was an advocate for the prosecution essentially. Satan was the defense, and God was the one who was allowed and had the ability to make the pronunciations. If Michael had done that, he would have been stepping out of place. Now, the reason that was brought up as an example is to show even Michael the archangel, who's incredibly powerful and perfectly holy, even he showed restraint in what he did. And what we're going to get to tonight in verse 10 in particular is basically looking at these heretics and saying they have no restraint. They're simply action. They're not thinking. They're doing. They're acting on instinct. They're doing what they want to do. So he's trying again to bring the contrast between Michael and this, and the other things he's shown too, between Michael and what these people are. Now I'm going to go ahead and read verses 9 and 10, even though we did 9 last week. But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil, argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." But these men revile, and these men here meaning the heretics, or the false teachers. But these men revile the things which they do not understand, and the things which they know by instinct. Like unreasoning animals, by these things they are destroyed. And we're going to see some interesting things here. It's funny, I read this verse and I think, like, aren't we living that today? I mean, it really feels like that a lot of times when we listen to people and their reasoning and everything else and the screaming, and it's just kind of like, I think we're falling into this already. But the first thing we want to look at here is it says they revile the things in the NASB. You probably have some different things in different translations. In the original, we're again dealing with the word blaspheme. That's transliterating there. We're dealing with the word blaspheme. And whatever it is, they're speaking out again. They're just speaking in ways they shouldn't be speaking. They're putting things down that they shouldn't be doing. Essentially, slander. Slander is a good word for that, actually. Slander would be a literal translation of the word blaspheme. So they're slandering things that they simply don't understand. And again, I have to look at that and go, wait a second, that sounds like today again. In addition to that, the Greek word here, when it talks about they revile things which they do not understand, that's the word oida, which can be translated as understand, or more commonly translated as knowledge. Essentially saying, you don't even have any knowledge about this, and yet you're slandering them and things like that. It'd be like if I walked to somebody that I never knew, and said, "You scumbag, what in the world were you?" And I didn't even know who they were. That's kind of what he's saying here is, these guys don't even have a clue as to what they're talking about, yet it's filled with slander and blasphemies.
That's common on a lot of topics.
Yeah, it is.
Today, it's, one of the things that surprises me is that it's very easy to lie to people about things specifically that they have no idea about.
Right.
And one of them back in 2012 was that the United States is stealing, they're using so much of the energy, but they're only so much of a producer of it. Mm-hmm. And the lie there is electricity is easily, generated. Yeah. Right? So we're not stealing anything. So, but you can convince masses of people that this is true.
Well, go back to the idea of what Hitler did with Goebbels. The big lie theory. The issue is if you have a big lie and you repeat it enough and you say it enough, eventually people will believe it. Let me ask you a question just historically here. Does anybody know where Hitler got the big lie theory from? Guess he got it from somebody else who used it successfully previously. No. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had almost 100,000 political prisoners in the United States, primarily ministers and people like that. Anyone who was against entering World War I. In the Brethren churches and the Grace Brethren churches, they were decimated. Their ministers, they were being thrown in prison, one after another. The elders were being thrown in prison because Woodrow Wilson would not tolerate, he was an academic, and he would not tolerate that type of speech. The big lie, he actually had set up things almost like the communists did, where families were to spy on each other. And so it's amazing to go back and look at Wilson's presidency. But Hitler and Goebbels specifically attributed the big lie that he got from Wilson specifically. So it's something that's been used. But you mentioned that. Really, it's what we have today is, again, if you scream it loud enough, enough people will believe it, and that's what they're trying for. Almost all the news broadcasts are like that. And let me just throw something out here about screaming without knowledge and without understanding. One of the big debates today is transvestites in women's restrooms, transgenders in women's swimming. I don't know if you saw it or not, but going the other way around, there was a very, very good professional women's boxer who decided she wanted to be a champion in the men's division, okay? And she literally was transformed into a physically looking man, got the hormone injections and everything else, went into the ring against a relatively average boxer about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she lasted 21 seconds. That was it. And it probably could have been over quicker than that had the guy wanted to be quicker than that. The point is there are differences between men and women, and the bad thing is when you turn that around, you know, you've got a guy who was, number 500, 700 in the world as a swimmer, and the men, who suddenly can win all the competitions among the women. And yet, think about this. Think about the way it's presented. How is it presented? Well, if he claims to be a female, you know, if you think about this just in a logical sense, this is like, what are you talking about? This is insane.
Well, they say gender is a social construct.
Right, exactly.
As absurd as that sounds.
As a matter of fact, some states have now, I think California is one of them, that is trying to get gender removed from the birth certificates because they can't assign gender until the child grows a little more to figure out what it is. Well, I don't know about you, but I can figure out what it is when it's born.
Why don't you just look at...
Yeah, I know. That's what I mean. I mean, trust me, there is a way to figure it out.
That confirms the gaslighting that they do. When
Right.
They have news articles that say babies know their identity. After
Exactly. And the reason I bring this up isn't even to talk about that subject. It's just to say, instinctively, we know this is wrong. You don't have to be a thinker. You don't have to be a deep thinker to know men shouldn't be participating in women's sports against women. It's that simple. Several of the basketball games, I've seen a couple of times where literally the women were being knocked out in high school games and college games. I mean, physically, knocked to the floor and knocked cold because the guys are so much stronger. They can't compete with it. And it's not a criticism of women, it's just that they should have the ability to play in their own sports and enjoy them. And the reason I bring this up is this is exactly what these people were doing. What he's saying is they were slandering the things they don't even understand. And that's what we got going on today, but that's what was happening in the church then. Remember, this isn't talking about how the Roman life was at. You know, yes, Romans promoted homosexuality, okay? So what? He wasn't talking about that. He wasn't talking about the Romans. He's talking about within the church this is happening. You've got leaders coming in and claiming to be leaders, and you can't allow this, okay? It's funny, one thing that I have frequently said is, sometimes the greatest praise is the condemnation of fools. And this reminds me of this, is that, you know, if I have the fools saying that I'm an idiot, I'm probably doing a pretty good job at whatever I'm doing. The other thing I want to bring up here again is last week we talked about something called the Men Deconstruction, okay? And that is, you'll find that in Greek, M-E-N, I'm transliterating here, it's literally mu epsilon nu, but M-E-N, and then later on you find day, which is the word which is typically translated as but, and, even, things like that. When you see this men deconstruction, it literally translates as on the one hand and on the other hand. Or if you have multiple days, especially, you can have on the one hand, on the other hand, and then you got another day, and they even do this. Okay? So it's a way of emphasizing these two choices or three choices or whatever it is. Well, you have that in verse 9, and all of a sudden in verse 10, you have the same thing happening here. Because he's starting to say in the beginning, on the one hand, they blaspheme what they don't understand. They slander what they don't understand. And on the other hand, all of their knowledge comes through instincts like wild beasts. So what he's really saying here is, look at the two sides of this. This is a horrible situation. How many people have a dog in here? Or have had a dog?
I have a dog right outside.
Okay, I'm sorry, okay. If you've had a dog, especially a normal dog, and we have an 85-pound eating machine at home, okay, that is pure muscle. That's the only way to put it, okay, with a ridge that grows backwards on his back of hair growing up his back, okay. This eating machine will, when food comes out, will salivate, will keep trying to get in the, I mean, it's like, get in the living room. So you know what he'll literally do? He'll go, walk into the living room and stand and stop at the edge and look, in the living room. So he steps into the living room and then he'll walk directly out of the living room again. I went in the living room. So the point is, this dog is driven by food. You want him to do anything, get treats out. That's all it is, it's instinct. It's just this instinct. It's an overwhelming, ravenous food instinct. Think of that when you're thinking of these people, these heretics. They're not thinking of what does God want. They're thinking in terms of what earthly pleasures can I get? What do I want to do? What do I want to say? That's what he's really talking about there. He's not talking, and so what he's saying is they blaspheme what they don't understand, and on top of that, they're just going on instinct and acting like wild beasts. And when you think about it, Bible teachers that are also acting like wild beasts are not a good combination. Let me say this. When we are looking for a new pastor in a little while, we probably want one that doesn't act like a wild beast with instinct, period, okay? So the reason I bring this up is that's what they were looking at right there. And not only that, even their instincts had been corrupted. Think about this. We talk about how absurd it is, for example, with the transgender things and stuff like that, okay? If you think about it, a lot of these people, they really believe it. They have been through years and years of education. I've had good conversations with people that are in their early 20s, okay? Where we've talked about things like gender theory and diversity theory and all this stuff. They've actually been trained for so long, they believe it. And not only that, they've gone off the beam in some cases into immorality in some cases so much that it doesn't even affect them anymore. What's happened is their consciences have been seared, and even they're not only acting on instincts, but their instincts are corrupt. That's what Jude is saying here and talking to these people when he's saying about literally, but they know by which they know by instinct, like wild animal, like unreasoning animals, by these things they are destroyed. Now, one of the things I want to ask about here, actually, we'll get to that in a minute. I want to talk about destroyed in a minute. Also want to talk, we talk about the things in this world today, this application here. I don't know if you heard it or not, but Gordon Ramsay has sold his pub that he has in London. Millions and millions of dollars he was going to get for it. Entered into the agreement, signed all the contracts and everything else. You know what happened? I think if the deal hasn't fallen through, he's going to lose a lot of money anyway. Because 6 professional squatters, get that term, moved into the place while they were trying to do the settlement. And not only that, had put up legal notices showing why no one can come in and touch them, and they'll have people arrested if they do that. His entire restaurant basically has fallen apart. It is in such disrepair, they're probably going to have to gut the entire thing if they ever get the people out of it. They've been trying to evict them, and the courts aren't helping them. The reason I bring this up is this is insanity. The idea that someone, if you literally, we're finding the U.S., we're finding people that go away for a 10-day vacation, come back and find someone has occupied their house, and the court says, they've been there 10 days, it's their house now as well as yours. You can't evict them. Up in New York State, I don't know if you heard about this one, about a month ago or so, where the woman went and changed the locks because they did this to her when she went away from one of her houses, okay? The police came and arrested her and put her in jail because she changed the locks and did not give the squatters a key. Because under New York law, the squatters have the right to, and let me say this, these laws were put in place 100 to 200 years ago because if the town courthouse burned down and nobody had any deeds or anything like that, they'd need to be able to, get people in the right place and redo new deeds. There is no rational reason for a squatter law anymore in the United States. But the reason I bring this up is this is normal. As a matter of fact, down in Texas, I don't know if you followed this one or not, they had squatters moving into a woman's house. Literally, they've been here 8 months, destroyed the place. By the way, if you get squatters, you have to go through the eviction process. The police won't throw them out. And in some cases, they'll come up with things, a napkin saying, I own this house. Well, that's a deed in their mind, so therefore they can stay there because they're squatters and they have a napkin they wrote themselves that says this, until you evict them. The woman down in Texas, this past year, 8 months, come to court in early December, and the judge says, well, technically we could evict them now, but the holidays are coming up, and I don't want them to have no place to go. And she not only left, the woman herself had no place to go. Didn't matter. I don't know how long, but the last I heard, they were still there in that house in Texas they took over. She went on a trip somewhere to Florida, I think to a second house or something like that, came back. The reason I bring this stuff up isn't to talk about all modern stuff. What I'm saying is, it's insanity when you start thinking about the laws and the way they're being applied. It doesn't make any sense. The instincts are corrupt, and we've got the same thing happening now, except in Jude, it's in the church itself. Okay? Not only that, let me say this. If you haven't followed it, you should know about this. There are a number of pushes in various states, especially California right now, to legalize pedophilia. And I don't know if you know this or not. In California, they found out that buying sex with a minor is not a felony. It's only a misdemeanor. So they brought forth a law in California to change it to a felony. Guess what? They couldn't get it passed. That happened about 2 weeks ago or so.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully they will. But even then, they want to change it to a felony with up to 4 years in prison as a maximum. Gee, wow, 4 years in prison for buying a child for sex. This stuff is sick, but again, the people that are doing it, their instincts are so corrupted that that's why it's happening. And you have the same thing here. Now, remember again, these heretics we're talking about were within the church, not outside the church, okay? And this lasciviousness, this defiling the flesh he spoke about in other verses, again, that's within the church. As crazy as that sounds, and as horrible it is to think about, think back to the 1980s, 1990s. We had Jim Baker. We had Jimmy Swaggart. We had Hillsong Church. You know, all over the country, people are singing the songs written by Hillsong, okay? You know what Hillsong was founded, the founding guy, what Frank Houston founded it on? He basically set the thing up and was using it as a place to get young boys for him to have sex with. Nobody even disputes that. And then his son, who took over Hillsong after that, Brian Houston, ended up being taken to court in Australia. Unfortunately, they let him off because they couldn't prove it. He was covering for him. This is happening today in the churches with people that we see as church leaders. I mean, you remember Swaggart. Swaggart was condemning Baker, and all of a sudden it turned out, gee, Swaggart was doing just as bad as Baker was. You know, Baker was doing the things as well. Each of these things, and not just that. It's funny, if you look at the pastors that are preaching today, okay, in many churches, again, we're isolated, we're insulated here, and it's good and bad both. We're insulated here from what's really going on. If you start going from church to church to church, you're going to find not only pastors who aren't living the way they should, you're going to find prosperity gospel. Okay? You give me enough money, you're going to get rich. I mean, I literally, who was it? Saw an interview years ago with, one of the big prosperity gospel preachers, two of the prosperity gospel preachers were talking about how they need, who's the guy that wanted the airplane? Not Creflo Dollar, another one that needed a $60 million airplane.
It's not Copeland.
He was, I think it was Copeland. He was interviewing another guy. And the other guy said that he had a decent car, but that he refused it and he wanted, top of the line Mercedes or whatever it was. Because he said, how would it look for God's representative to pull up in front of the church in some kind of an average car or something like that? It would just be putting God down, and everybody would know God wasn't true if I didn't have the best of the best of the best. That's being taught out there. Social gospel, where basically what we're saying again is all these social constructs come ahead of God. Liberation theology has been around with us for 60, 70 years at least probably, started in South America and Central America especially. And again, you've got situations where this has been going on and on and on. Actually, I wish I'd have brought this. Did I bring this or not? Lifeway and Ligonier Ministries put out a survey. Yeah, I think I brought it with me. Put out a survey in 2022 where they did surveys of evangelicals, okay, to find out what evangelicals believed. I'm not talking about the, non-believers, okay? Actually, wrong one there. Sorry, I may not have it with me. Anyway, what I was going to say is they found things like the vast majority of evangelicals did not believe in hell. I think it was like 58% did not believe Jesus was the only way to heaven. These are people claiming to be evangelicals in evangelical churches. Jesus, they presented a statement to them which says that Jesus was the first being created by God. 73% of evangelicals said yes to that.
Oh, my word.
That's Jehovah's Witness doctrine.
Yeah.
That's also the doctrine of Arius from the Nicene Creed, where the Council of Nicene, where they had to debate that. This is things where you look at it and you go, wait a second. And this is from Lifeway and Ligonier Ministries, which I don't like everything Lifeway puts out, but this is a pretty good survey they put out, and Ligonier's the one that actually did the work. And they're generally, they're more toward the covenant theology side, but they do pretty solid work. And the thing I was going to say is we're seeing this in the church. It's not just outside the church, it's in the church. Before I say anything else, any questions or comments? Anybody want to throw up? Yeah, go ahead, Don. You're next.
Oh, no,
okay.
I'm gonna throw
you want to throw up? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Just a comment. The brain is very powerful, and we can convince ourselves that anything is true.
Absolutely.
Even to the point, as a, I don't know if I want this on the tape, but like as a little girl,
Yeah.
I would lay in bed sometimes, and I wasn't sleepy yet, but I would picture complete blackness except for my bed in the in my brain, and I'm laying in the bed, and I would start the bed going like this in my brain until I felt it happening. Right, like the brain, and it was like, oh, I was like on a carnival ride or something. It was cool.
I understand.
Right? But like it's so powerful.
Right.
You can convince yourself that anything is true. You can convince yourself that memories, like things happened in a different way. Or no, I heard you say this.
Right.
And like we cannot be trusted.
Right. You're right.
We cannot be. I cannot trust myself.
One of the problems they found in a lot of these, let me say, sexual abuse is rampant today. But things like in the McMartin case in California, when they actually started digging into it, took years to do it. It looks like it was primarily implanted memories. And if you actually heard, in that case, if you actually heard the tapes of the psychologist, the person interviewing the kids, I was horrified when I heard that. It was like, good grief, she's telling them what to say, and they're going along with it. Yeah, okay. And they all ended up, and then, don't get me wrong, if it's real sexual abuse with kids, man, put them away, shoot them, do whatever you want with them. I don't care. But in that case, you had people whose lives are destroyed because of implanted memories. And also in the satanic sacrifices. I do believe that actually happens in some cases, okay? And I know this, some of the things the police called me in to look at wasn't human, but it was animal. And I got to see firsthand when they asked me to look at crime scenes for them and things like that. But the thing I was going to say is that these sacrifices among that, what destroyed people digging deeper into it were people who were obviously false memories, who couldn't have been where they were and things like that. It's almost, think about this. Let's say you want to destroy the idea that something's happened. Fine. Put out somebody with an outlandish story on that exact thing you're talking about as a red herring, basically.
Oh yeah, it's poison the well.
Exactly, poison the well. And that's exactly what they did there.
They do it constantly.
Yeah, exactly. But no, what you're talking about, you're right. The brain is interesting in that. The other thing is just going back to one thing. I mentioned liberation theology. We had, I don't like to generally try to say who's a Christian and who's not, okay? But I will say this, over and over and over, I heard Barack Obama was a Christian when he was president, okay? I have a number of reasons for doubting that. But the one thing that I heard him and I had a recording of, and I had a pastor who didn't believe me. I said, here's a recording. Actually, I sent it to him. I said, Barack Obama was on video saying, my salvation depends on the collective salvation of others. That's liberation theology. And obviously, at least he wasn't a church leader, but the point is, this is a common belief among others that in order to save someone, you have to better society. When you better society, that's how you get saved. And that's what liberation theology basically is. So,
during his first campaign in 2008, he said he joined the church first time because he saw that it wasn't just an instrument of oppression of black people. It was also a way to for social action.
I don't want to.
It was a means to social action.
You're right. And I don't want to turn this on.
That's why he said he joined the church.
You're right. I don't want to turn this into a president bashing thing here, but I will say this. Then you look at the church he joined, Jeremiah Wright. Jeremiah Wright was never a preacher of the gospel.
Well, he got in trouble because somebody taped him, and
but not just that, but
Obama had to disavow him, although he didn't really want to.
Right. But no, what we're seeing is all of this is going through, unfortunately, not only politics, but again, what's horrifying is the leaders in the church. Sometimes also, I believe these were here, they're deliberately planted. I mentioned the one that I went through at First Baptist of Carroll. I think he was a deliberate plant. I found stuff that was going on there that was horrifying when I actually got to the bottom of it. And he was, like I said, every degree was false, everything he said was false, everything else. And I think he was put into place so that at some point in time he could destroy the faith of the people in that church. But again, whether it's deliberate plant or just totally acting on their own, these people were completely out of line and not based on knowledge. Now, one thing I want to also go to here is the word in the end says they are destroyed, okay? Now, two things I want to say is, you could look at it and say, well, yeah, because they're off the mark, they're going to be eventually destroyed because they go to hell, okay? And I think that's part of it, okay? But there's some other things here. Number one, this is not the most common word in the Greek that would be used for the word destroyed. Normally we would use the word luo, which is either destroy or to loose, one or the other. That's not the word that's used here. This word here has a slightly different connotation. It's corrupted or spoiled, okay? And not only that, the other thing I was going to say is in this case, it's in the passive voice. And in the passive voice, it literally means that they are led astray. And essentially, if you think about it, those who are led astray are being destroyed on this earth and ultimately being destroyed. By the way, when I say passive voice, do you know what I'm talking about here or not? Okay, just want to make it happens in English too, so if you don't, I can go over quickly. But yeah, this is a passive verb here, and that's maybe a participle, I'm not sure, but the point is that's what's happening here. So again, now take everything we just discussed on verse 10, and now contrast it to verse 9. Michael, who was with the exception of God, probably one of the most powerful, holy creatures in the universe, was saying, I don't have the right to act as a judge in this situation. I can only prosecute. He had restraint. And then you look at the next one, no knowledge, instincts only, instincts that have been corrupted, and they're just making pronouncements all over the place. And that's what you've got here, is a situation where the contrast is amazing when you start looking at that. Now, unless we have any questions on verse 10, we're going to go to verses 11 through 13 are kind of as a group together. We're going to go on to move verse 11. Anything else on 10? All right. And by the way, I know I tend to get wrapped up and get into things and just start talking, so please feel free to put your hands up and interrupt me. It's okay.
I'm ready on Balaam. I'm ready on Balaam.
Balaam. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. You're trying to get with, okay, gotcha. Well, that's cool, because we're going to get to Balaam definitely. All right, now all of a sudden we're in verse 11. And the first thing that strikes me in verse 11 is he starts out with, woe to them. He's not just talking anymore about these are so horrible and here's all the characteristics. He's going to give more characteristics, but he's actually pronouncing on them, look, you guys, this is just plain wrong, period. Okay? So he's saying, woe to them. He wants God's pronouncement upon them, but he's also bringing up Old Testament examples. And when you look at Balaam, Cain, and Korah, the one thing we have in common, especially with Balaam and Korah, especially Korah, is I don't believe any Gentile in that civilization would have understood what he was talking about with those examples. I believe it had to be Hebrews, and that's the reason also why I've said before, one of the reasons, there's other ones, why I believe this is a fairly early book of the Bible. It was a Hebrew church without Gentiles in it, or very few Gentiles, if any, in it. Okay. The other thing also that we want to look at with Cain, Balaam, and Korah, anybody have any idea give me some things they had in common with each other? All three, just think overall. And by the way, does everybody know who Balaam and Korah was? If you don't, okay.
Balaam's the guy with the donkey talked to him.
Yeah, okay, so we had he was actually a prophet, and God had the donkey talk and rebuked him, okay? And we'll get to more on that in a minute. Korah led a rebellion against Moses, okay? What do you think? Can you think of anything these three have in common with each other, just off the top of your head?
Well, they were very self-motivated.
Very selfish, very motivated, very self-motivated, very proud. Okay, that's one thing, definitely. I agree. Willing to stand up against God-ordained authority. One other thing which I think is critical, which we rarely think about, and when I say God-ordained authority, I don't just mean a position. For example, when Cain killed Abel, it was a situation of he was doing what he wanted instead of what God said to do. But there's more to Cain also. But one other thing is, all three of these people influenced others. They weren't content to just corrupt themselves. They were influencing others. And that's who he's comparing these people to. These false teachers coming in, they weren't happy to just have their own false teachings. They were going to come back in and see to it that they corrupted everybody. Now let's talk about a moment, gone in the way of Cain, okay? What does that mean to you guys? Any opinions on that? Gone in the way of Cain.
Sin was crouching at his door.
Okay.
And God said, you can master it. But then he didn't.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Anything else? Going in the way of Cain. Anybody else got an opinion on what that might mean or entail or any implications of it?
Jealousy.
It's okay to kill people. Jealousy. Okay. Think about this, though. We're all focusing on what Cain did to Abel. Is that the legacy of Cain? Is that the life of Cain? If I talk about going in the way of Cain, am I just talking about the murder? Have you ever read Cain's genealogy?
Oh, yeah, he's
I mean, it's
the
a
foundation of the
yeah.
church.
It's a horror story.
Yeah.
It's an absolute, and you got one guy, right? Well, so many, I forget what it was. One guy saying, well, so and so murdered so many guys, but I murdered even more. Type, things like that going on and on. His genealogy, I mean, it looks like one of the Halloween movies or something like that. Okay, it is horrifying. And these are all before the flood, too. Remember, they all got wiped out. But the point is, the genealogy of Cain is just horrible. And the reason is Cain's influence on those people is what did it. And think about this too. Cain just murdered Abel. And what is his first thought? Well, I don't want to get killed. Protect me somehow. I mean, think about it. It's like, if he had a conscience, Cain might have been saying, yeah, I guess I probably deserve to die for what I did to Abel. You never heard any remorse whatsoever from Cain. You didn't even hear an apology from Cain. So my point is, I think the way of Cain, I believe, is more than just what Cain did in that one act. It's his entire lifestyle. It's the fact that he infected an entire generation, which went on and on and on, and it created generations of evil. It wasn't just the evil act that he did. And here's what I think he's saying here is these teachers are coming in to not just be wrong, not just commit the act of heresy, which they're doing, but they want to infect everyone here and want it to bleed on out and just corrupt the church. So I think that's what he means by the way gone in the way of Cain. You can disagree with me on that, that's okay. I can't prove that, but I really believe that's what's entailed here, not just the murder of Abel. As if that wasn't enough. By the way, something else, just a side note here. Who were the first two children of Adam and Eve? Anyone want to tell me? Should be easy. Who are the first two children of Adam and Eve? All right, how about the first three?
George and Helen.
George and Helen, you got it. Now, who were the first two or three children of Adam and Eve?
Seth was one of them.
Seth was what? The third one?
Yeah.
Okay, who are the first two? Cain and Abel, okay. You know something? Bible never says that. Bible never says that.
But that's the first two that we
Nope.
know about.
The first two we know about, exactly. The point is, there are, actually I have a paper I can send anyone that wants on this that I wrote years ago. There is ample proof that Cain and Abel could not have been the first two. Because Seth, the third who's mentioned, was to replace Abel when Abel died, meaning Seth wasn't even born until Abel was killed. If that's true, and it was just Cain and Abel, and they were the first two, and Seth was number three, then who is Cain worrying about all these cousins and everything that's going to murder him and kill him for what he did to Abel if there's nobody else on the planet? The reason we know about Cain and Abel is because God needed us to know about them for what they taught us. It wasn't because they were the first two. Could Cain or Abel have been the first? Could Cain have been the first child? He could have been. But it would have had to have been a lot of other children there also before Seth as well. And I doubt that he was, to be honest with you. If you look at the way the Hebrews write the scripture, it is chronological, but it's also thematic. In other words, chronological doesn't mean that it's this time, this time, this time, this time. It may be, we'll tell you about this, and then we're going to tell you about this story up here, etc. There's a verse in Daniel, I think right before the writing appears on the wall. But if you don't look closely, it screws up your entire interpretation of Daniel. You know why? There's at least a 30-year gap between two verses. And most of us don't even look for that. When we're looking at context, we've got to look at things like that. But that was a normal way for a Hebrew to write. That wasn't an oversight. That's why the Hebrews tend to write thematically. The Greek tended to write more logically and chronologically. It's just the nature of the writing.
Well, the Bible it was never intended to be this full history. It's not a history book.
Right. The Bible is not a history book, but everything in the Bible that's said is true history. Same with science. The Bible is not a science text, but all scientific knowledge in the Bible is true.
This is not a text for a college course on the history of...
Right.
It's not a complete account.
It's not complete,
yes,
exactly.
That's what
but it has everything we need, and everything in it is true.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is one of the reasons I have such problem with theistic evolution, is because no matter how you cut it, you cannot, even if you extend the days to millions and billions of years or whatever, you cannot harmonize it with evolution, because otherwise what you have to start with is you have the plants existing for millions of years and the trees existing before the sun and moon are created. So that would be a real problem for theistic evolution, among others. So I believe everything in the Bible is true, but it's not complete. I would agree with that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, with Cain and Abel,
Mm-hmm.
in light of the fact that they all lived for so many hundreds of years,
Mm-hmm.
it's conceivable that they had children and their children had
Oh, yeah.
children, and and that Abel was 500 before Cain
Right.
killed him.
Agreed. And not only that, it's not only conceivable, it's likely. Because the way Cain is talking, it's not just my brothers are going to do this, it's, cousins and people like that, which would mean multiple generations occurring. So I agree with you. He probably didn't kill him when he was 20 or something like that.
Right, and he was asking about, wasn't that when God instituted the sanctuary cities?
I thought that was later. I thought that was under the Mosaic Law. I could be wrong there.
Oh, no. What
He
was
basically
that
put a
thing
mark
with
on him that
Cain?
said you can't touch him.
Oh, okay.
And that's how he protected him. And it's funny too, think about it. God's grace extended to someone who was absolutely reprobate and who was polluting an entire generation, and God still said, I'm going to let you do this. And I think in some ways it wasn't just to protect Cain, it was to say, you want to be evil? Fine. I'm going to let this play out and see how it is, and you're going to have absolutely nothing you could possibly say as far as the judgment goes because you're so evil. It's just a personal opinion there. Now let's go back here, back to Cain and Abel. We just did that. Let's go to Balaam, because we got questions on Balaam I know already, okay? You want to start with the questions before we go on?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So, woe to them, for they have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit.
Right.
So I just happened to, I'm listening to the Bible, and I just happened to get to the story of Balaam.
In Numbers.
Yep, Numbers 22.
Right.
And I got really confused because, so Balak sends for Balaam, because he wants Balaam to come and curse the people of Israel because they covered the face of the earth.
Right.
Right. But the people come there, and it says, then God came to Balaam. Who are these men with you? Tells them. And God said to Balaam, you shall not go with them, you shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the people that Balak sent, go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you.
Right.
And then they come back again. Balak sends more important people, and then Balaam says, let's see, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of Yahweh my God to do less or more. And let me see what God's going to tell me tonight. And then God says to Balaam at night, God came to Balaam at night and said to him, if the men come to call to you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that shall you do.
Right.
So Balaam rose and went. Verse 22. God's anger was aroused because Balaam went. Like, God just told him to go.
Exactly, right. Okay.
And Balaam's like, and all through here, there's like, he's hitting the donkey, and that he shouldn't be doing that because the angel of the Lord is standing there with his sword drawn.
Right.
But
I understand.
God,
Good question.
where's the greed? I didn't like where.
What I'd like is if you can do a 30-page paper for us on that, is beautiful. No, seriously, I agree with you. Now, there's some things, though, that I think are not coming through.
Okay, yes, this is my question, because I believe that
Number
all
one,
this is true.
yeah. I think that number one, Balaam was going beyond what God was allowing to start with. Okay? So I think that's one thing. Balaam didn't just go. The other thing I was going to say is, yes, God told him to go, but also I think that Balaam basically was also looking at it like, this is still a way to get wealthy, okay? So sometimes, we may know the truth, but we can stretch it a little bit or emphasize it a little different. And I could be wrong, but I think that's what Balaam was planning on doing, and that's why he had the donkey talk instead. Number two, there's something else we got to remember here. Balaam was not a false prophet. That may sound weird, doesn't it? Balaam was a wicked prophet. Now, what's the difference? A false prophet is somebody that says, God just came to me and said, you guys got to provide 10 pizzas and a bunch of caramel candy for me tonight, okay? And I just made it up out of thin air. That's a false prophet. By the way, I don't want pizza or caramel tonight either. But that's a false prophet. A wicked prophet is one that God actually is giving messages to. But the guy is not following through on it. And not only that, one of the reasons I say that Balaam was, yes, God said to do it, but I also think that God, it's funny, I'd have to look at the Hebrew a little bit more on that, and I'll tell you why in a second. Even though God allowed Balaam to do it, I don't think God was enthusiastic about it, if you know what I'm saying. And when he did do it, Balaam he sent with the idea, you're going to go, fine, go, but then you got to say the things that I tell you to say. And even though Balaam said he was going to do that, verses like this tell us, and other places we see tell us, Balaam really was still concerned about the money. Because it talks about the
sake of gain for Balaam.
Yeah, exactly. It talks about the headlong in the error of Balaam. And for pay they have rushed headlong into the error of Balaam. Okay? Now, one thing that we could say this is Balaam was still trying to prophesy, and I think probably to help this other king, okay?
So maybe the fact that, because when they went to get him the first time, they were bringing money.
Yes.
Right. So maybe the error is that he did go and follow God. He did what God said, but he took the money.
Yeah, and not only that, he didn't really put his foot down, if you know what I'm saying. It's one thing to say no, it's another thing to, he's still got the dialogue open, they're sending more people, and so, no, why isn't Balaam standing literally at the gate of his house saying, get out of here, I don't even want to talk to you, God's already told me this. That's one of the things we do to ourselves sometimes, let's face it. We don't necessarily want to sin, but we want to bring it in and play with it a little while and see what it's like, and then decide whether we're going to sin or not type thing. I think that's what Balaam was doing. Personal opinion there to some degree. Let me also say something else, and again, I have to look, I don't know on this one issue. I have to look a little bit more closely, because you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the whole question of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Well, how can you hold Pharaoh accountable if God's the one that did it, right? Have I spoken about Pharaoh's heart before? Have I mentioned that? Okay. You'd remember it if I did. Pharaoh's heart, we got, I think it's like 11 places or something, 9 or 11 places where it said over and over again, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Okay? Do you know that's the English? In the Hebrew, there's 3 totally separate words that are used for hardened. And the first of those, which is used repeatedly in the beginning, is hardening of the heart in that case was not turning his heart in a different direction. Hardening of the heart was saying, fine, you want to do it, I will confirm that you can do it in your own way. So in the beginning, God didn't take Pharaoh and say, you must do it this way. I'm wondering if we may have a situation similar with Balaam, and I have not looked at the Hebrew here, okay? But the second time it gets a little worse. By the third time in the very end with Pharaoh, finally he comes down to the idea of, fine, you're going to do it this way, I'm going to see to it that you're going to do it this way. But that was in the very end after Pharaoh had already made up his mind, done all this, etc. And it was God saying, you want to be evil? Fine, do it. I'm not going to stop you. And that was the hardening type thing. So again, I haven't looked here, but I'm wondering if you may have a similar situation with Balaam. You haven't looked at it.
I haven't.
Okay, just thought I'd ask.
Yeah.
I haven't done a deep study of Balaam, but I have to wonder again if it's something where God's saying okay may not be exactly what it appears to be in the English. And I could be wrong there too, but I have to go back and look. I don't know. I do say that sometimes. She enjoys it when I say I don't know. No, actually,
I was wrong.
I know I was wrong about that. Wrong about what you said, right? No, her favorite phrase is when I say I was wrong. Those three.
She even had a Facebook post about it.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
By the way, if you guys wonder the key to successful marriage, there's 3 special words. I was wrong.
Well, I have to say it too sometimes.
I know. I'm just teasing here.
I did have a thought about Balaam though.
Please.
The very fact that the donkey is stopping
Mm-hmm.
and he is hell-bent on getting to this king.
Right.
Is like, it kind of tells you, you'd have thought that he might include in, there's nothing here, why is the donkey stopping?
Right. The heart attitude had a problem.
Yeah.
And I agree. That's a good point, is that the donkey stopping over and over the way it did, again, I think it was probably a heart attitude type thing.
It's just a little thing, but it's just another indicator that he
Yeah.
is not in the right place.
Let me say
So
this.
here's
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So I'm not all the way through the story of Balaam in my
Go ahead.
reading yet.
Yeah, go through
So I
chapter
just-
24.
Yeah, so I just got to 24, and 24 verse 1 says, now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, so this is after the 3rd prophecy.
Right.
When it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to seek to use sorcery, but he set his face toward the wilderness. And Balaam raised his eyes, saw Israel encamped according to their tribes, and the Spirit of God came upon him.
Yeah.
There's more.
Yeah.
But I didn't, so that there's just a little part there of to seek to use sorcery,
Oh, yeah.
but I
Even
didn't
though
see
he-
that before then.
Right. Even though he was a prophet, sorcery was wrong, period. And you're right. That's what he was doing as well. But again, he was actually getting real messages from God.
Yeah.
But they weren't what they should have. He was doing it the wrong way to start with. Let me say something also about the influence of money. I will never forget one of my dad's friends that fun guy to be around. And I remember something he used to say. He married a woman who was actually very, very well off, okay, financially, very well off. And the way he put it was, it's easy to fall in love with a woman. It's easy to fall in love with a rich woman. How do you get it? The way it came out was, it's easy to fall in love with a woman, and if she's rich, perhaps even a little easier. Okay, something along those lines. And the point is, I think with Balaam, you've got a situation where the money is still influencing him, even though, I think that's what we're talking about here. And especially the way Jude puts it, money was evidently the problem here. Now, something else that you want to look at is, were these guys trying to extract money from the church as well? Because they're running after the same, did they want to be paid for what they were doing? And I don't know. You've got to make good money on the heresy.
Was Balaam, so...
Yeah, go ahead.
What was Balaam's nationality? Because I was...
He was from Mesopotamia. I do not believe he was an Israelite from what I've seen. I could be wrong.
That's pretty much as I remember. Yeah.
He was not.
I'm sure he wasn't an Israelite.
Right.
Right, because he wasn't in the crowd.
No, he wasn't. Right. And they had to go to Mesopotamia to get him.
Right. So, but Cain, they have gone in verse 11. They've gone in the way of Cain.
Yeah.
An Israelite. Well.
Not an Israelite.
Not Israelite.
Yeah.
But in the line, right? And Korah.
Yeah.
And Balaam's out.
Think about this also. We've often talked about, well, God chose Abraham as his chosen person, and isn't that unfair? Okay. Let me say this. I can't prove this, but this is a good example of it. I do believe that God actually had contact with other people as well to try to get them to follow him, but I don't mean choosing them as chosen people. But for example, he obviously was communicating with this non-Israelite here.
Right.
And things of that nature. And the point is, so I believe there was still...
he was in Mesopotamia too.
Yeah. Well, true, but he left Mesopotamia and came from Ur, exactly. Exactly.
Jethro wasn't Moses' father-in-law. He wasn't.
Right, he was from Midian.
Midian.
Oh, I said Miriam. Point is that when you look at it, I do believe God had contact with other groups. They just didn't follow him. And I don't believe it was the same as Abraham with that kind of contact, but I don't know for sure. But there obviously was some kind of contact as far as that goes.
Well, Abraham was chosen, right, because through his family, he was going to bless all nations.
Right.
But the other people, God wasn't going to go through their family to bless all nations.
But the point people I've heard make before is, well, that's unfair. Why did God choose Abraham? Why didn't he choose, some other people? Well, he actually did talk to the other people, and for some reason he chose to choose Abraham, whether it was for faith or whether it was for other reasons. So my point is that he was making contact, but by and large, I think God had probably been rejected to a large degree at that point in time. As far as Balaam goes, I think again the application here is the heretics were bribed and they were wicked. They were willing to do whatever. They could change their theological position for money. I think
weren't they? We don't know this, but weren't they teachers in the church? Some of them.
Oh yeah, these were coming in as teachers.
Well, we know the first Gnostics were teachers in the regular church.
Yes.
Until they got kicked out.
Right. Exactly. They tried to creep in, and something else to think about here is, it's far more dangerous to have people within the church doing this kind of thing than to people having outside the church. You look outside the church, okay, yeah, there goes the idiot again that's trying to tell us to do this, and we know that's not true. Yeah, it's easy for us to sit here and go, wow, social gospel, that ain't true. And think even in the church, and other churches. But if we had people here preaching it, and we don't, fortunately, but if we had people here preaching it, it might be far more difficult, it'd be far more dangerous. I will say this, personal opinion here, I will say that, and I don't mean that everyone who's involved in this thing I'm going to mention next is wicked, don't get me wrong. But I have seen so many cases where spiritual formation is being used to destroy churches nowadays. And again, most Christians don't even know what we're talking about here. And spiritual disciplines, man, that sounds as holy as anything you can think about. And I do agree Christians should be disciplined and practice certain things, okay? So I'm not knocking that. But if you start to realize what spiritual formation and the spiritual disciplines are and how they play together, all of a sudden you realize, wait, this isn't coming from God. This is a perversion of what God has said. And again, that's for another night to talk about that, because that could go on for on and on and Fortunately, in one of the churches I was in a couple years ago, the pastor there also recognized it, and he had a class for like 6 weeks or so with the men's group for about 40 or 50 of us, teaching us, and him and I would work together on it, but teaching why spiritual formation is corrupting things. And again, when you hear right now, don't think in terms of, hey, Carleton must be crazy. What's he got against spiritual formation, okay? Spiritual formation sounds good. It is not what it appears to be. In a lot of cases, Eastern mysticism and Eastern Orthodoxy repackaged as Christianity, which both of those I have problems with. They're different things, but I have problems with both of them.
A lot of lies work well because they sound good on the surface.
Exactly.
It prevents you from thinking deeper about
Right.
it.
I mean, if somebody came into the church saying, let me teach you the doctrine of corruption and lasciviousness, you know, it wouldn't exactly be, oh yeah, please.
You've
But when
got
you
to
come
have
in,
good branding.
yeah, hey, I've got spiritual disciplines you can follow for spiritual formation, to build your spiritual,
Oh, what's
all of a
that?
sudden, right, all of a sudden it sounds good. And that's what we've got to say. It's almost like, you ever watch when Congress passes a bill? It's never what it says it is. You know, if they had a bill to do genocide to somebody, it would be named the Love and Purification Bill of the United States or something. I mean, it's just,
Well, they had this live coverage on TV Saturday of these 4 and 8 bills that
Yeah.
passed. I watched some of that.
yeah,
I couldn't follow what they were saying, just in words.
exactly.
They had commentators to try to interpret what was going on.
Right. And the point is, though, is that these words are perverted as far as this goes. Let's move on to Korah for a minute here. Who can tell me a little bit about the rebellion of Korah?
I just
Go ahead.
listened to it.
Go ahead, you just read it. Go
I
ahead.
did. Yeah. So, so Korah got 250 of the chiefs throughout Israel. Korah was from the tribe of Levi.
Yes.
And these were people that were well known throughout the Israelites. So
And
there was-
well respected.
And well
Yeah.
respected. So there was Korah, and then Amirab, Amirab, and Danab, 2 guys who
Yeah.
were from the tribe of Reuben, and they got these people together. And Korah took his 250 people up and stood up against Moses and against Aaron, and they said, who do you think you are for elevating yourself above all of us? All of us are holy. What's gotten into you?
Right.
And Moses and Aaron fell down, and they were like, ruh-roh. All right. So basically, Moses says, go get your censers, fill them with incense and fire, and God's going to show you who's holy tomorrow. Come back tomorrow. And then he goes out into the camp with the other 2 people because, he says, call them and bring them up. And they're like, you're not good enough for us to come up. We're not going to come. And Moses is like, well, that's not too good for you. Right? So then the next day, the people of Korah comes up. This is great. Korah comes up and they're there up against Moses and Aaron. And then God, the glory of the Lord comes down, and God speaks to Moses and basically says, back up. Separate yourselves from these people so that I can deal with them in one moment. And then he goes out into the camp and he says, tell everybody else, get away from these people.
Yeah.
Get away from all these tents. And they come out, and now these 2 people, all the people who are like, and then Moses says, I tell you what, if these people die like normal people die, then you'll know I'm not from God. But if God does a new thing and opens the ground, then you're going to know I am doing it. And then as soon as he says that, the ground opens up and swallows all the people from the people in the tribe of Reuben that were going against. And then fire comes down and all the Korah people, boom, they're gone. And their little censers, they're probably just spinning there like in the movie. And they take those censers and they melt them down and they hammer them into covers for the altar as a sign or as a remembrance so that nobody else who's not of the tribe of Levi dares to come in and try to be priests. That's the other thing. The Korah people, they were from the tribe of Levi, but they weren't priests.
Right.
They were ministering. Moses like, isn't it enough for you? God has set you apart. You get to be close to the tabernacle. That's not enough for you?
Now, I do know this. The next time I need a Bible story told, I know where we're going for it. Okay. No, you got it right. But there's some things we want to look at in this.
And there's one more thing after.
Go ahead, please.
And then the next day, all these people had just died, the wrath of God, right? And then the next day, the people of Israel come up and they're like, why did you bring it? You're going to kill all of us over and over again. And then Aaron and Moses fall down again, and they're on the ground. And Moses turns to Aaron and says, get your incense, run, the wrath of God has been released. Aaron grabs his oil, and he was running in. The plague has started. He's running, he's doing the make atonement for the sin, and he got the dead bodies on the right, and the live bodies on the left, or maybe the other way around. And Aaron stops the plague once he covers over their sin, and 14,700 people died because the next day they were like, oh, he's gonna kill us. They don't learn.
I have a new movie that I'm going to sell a script to for Hollywood. And I'm going to call it Terminator 6, The Wrath of Moses and Aaron. But yeah, so we're talking about, again, something. Let me say something else that's interesting. And I see this all the time in the news today and everything. Was this not the ultimate case of projection, if you're familiar with that in psychological terms? What did they do? Moses, you're putting yourself above the people. We want to be above the people. I mean, that's really what they were saying. The exact things they accused Moses of was what they were doing. The other thing you have to remember here is Moses and Aaron were chosen by God to do this. Therefore, by going against Moses and Aaron, they were going against God himself. Okay? So they were taking God's choice and saying, that's not going to work for us. I want to do it instead. The other thing, too, is you had the earth open up, which was amazing. And by the way, nothing against you, John, but if someone is up here, whether it's you or anybody else, and during the middle of the sermon, the earth opens up, swallows you, and closes back up, I'm going to say that message is probably not a message I should have been listening to. Okay?
If we suddenly hear, move back.
Right. Exactly. Move back. Exactly.
Back away.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to watch. Yeah, someday I'm going to have to do that in the middle of a sermon. Just just sit up here, move back. Just to rattle them. Okay. So the point is, though, is that this is something not only that, from what I read, correct me if I'm wrong here, the earth opened up, swallowed not only all these people, but then God went around with the fire to find all these people in different tents and stuff. It wasn't just one opening up and taking it. That'd be bad enough. But I think he also went and burned up the tents and everything in different places. I could be wrong on that. But I could be the way it could be read either way, but I had the opinion of that, but I could be wrong. The other thing that got me is, if you look, with Korah and his people like that, what did God actually do? Did God simply swallow Korah up and kill him? No. Korah, his family, and his possession, and not only because people with him, the families and the possessions were also swallowed up in the earth. So, again, this is something where I think we can safely say God was ticked off, okay? Now, again, what we got is, think about how terrible God was angry, and then Jude saying, and perished in the rebellion of Korah, and comparing those people that perished to these false teachers who come in. That's pretty severe when you look at that. Yeah, it really is. Now, let me bring up something which is a topic which has to be addressed here, because I've actually encountered this. I'd like some opinions here. Can we use the story of Korah to say that we should not stand up against a pastor or an elder?
No.
Why?
No,
I've actually had people tell me that. Let me say another one they combined it with is, do not touch the Lord's anointed.
Oh, I've heard that.
I've heard that one.
In reference to a pastor.
Yeah, because that's what David said. I know.
Yeah,
Can't
exactly.
far be it from me.
Exactly. Why does or does not that apply, those two things?
Well,
By the way, from my background, I think you know that I've stood up against pastors before. Otherwise, I've already been struck down many times. And don't only those that deserve it, okay? Yeah, go ahead, somebody, Clint.
Well, in our denomination, pastors aren't the successors of the apostles or anything like that.
Yes.
They're not anointed by God.
Right. Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy both claim to be successors of the apostles.
Yeah, that's why I chose that phrase.
Yes, you're right.
And they're just Christians that have put in extra study,
Mm-hmm.
and we believe we believe sometimes they bring God's message.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
guaranteed.
Right, but you're right.
It's not
You're right.
guaranteed.
Let me say this, the second time that I went through an ordination board, first time Southern Baptist, second time was Grace Brethren, okay? The second time I went through, one of the first questions they asked me is, are you called to be a pastor, okay? And I had to step back and say, well, wait a second, guys, we gotta look at what that word actually means. In a sense, for example, of the Old Testament, no. In a sense of, did God open with a voice and saying, now you're going to take, no. Okay, it didn't happen that way. Do I believe God wanted me to do what I did? Absolutely, no question. But there is a difference between that and what we call a call. I think sometimes we get very carried away with the idea of the calling of a pastor. Sometimes the calling can be the pastor saying, God has equipped me, I can handle, or God will allow me to handle this, and that's a spot that needs to be filled, and I'm willing to fill it. Okay? I don't think it has to be this giant voice from above or something like that. And a lot of us, this applies not just to, it's funny, one of the things in the church that I was at, man, the one thing I kept stressing over and over is there shouldn't be a difference between me and you sitting there in the pews. Every one of you has been called. There's no such thing as a non-called Christian. And there's no such thing as a Christian who does not have a spiritual gift. If you don't have a spiritual gift in the church age, what you're telling me is, I'm not saved. Because every believer has a spiritual gift to be used for the edification of the church. And so my point is that whether it's a pastor, whether it's a Sunday school teacher, whether it's sitting in the nursery, whether it's doing the janitorial work, whatever it is, those are callings. But I don't necessarily believe that when God says be a janitor, he's going to say, time for the janitor. And even as far as ordination goes, okay, I went through it because the churches wanted that as a professional thing to do. I think ordination, frankly, out of Titus 1:5 is a complete mistranslation. It's been fixed in most of the modern editions. It's appoint elders, not ordain elders, okay? So let me say this. I think it might be a good thing to do from a standpoint of demonstrating competency. I think the exams are a good idea. But when we get it confused with the ordaining of the Old Testament ideas of anointing and ordaining, that's when we get into problems. Yeah, please.
I think you confused it a minute ago because you were talking about people who, whatever gift it might happen to be, and then you said, those are callings. And I think you meant gifts, didn't you?
Well, yeah, the gifts. No, what I'm saying is each believer has a calling. Every believer. If you're a believer who's not called, you're not a believer.
Okay.
That's okay. I need her as my editor. Believe it or not, when I speak, she not only edits my papers. When I speak, she'll pick up things. You said that. Yeah, I guess I did. I'll fix that now. So I appreciate that. But no, when I'm saying each believer has a spiritual gift for the edification of the church, and each believer is called to be doing something, whatever it is. So what I'm saying is, to me, the calling of a pastor is the same as, I'll get right to you, the calling of a pastor is the same as the calling of a janitor. It doesn't mean that God came in this way. It doesn't mean that God came down like David and said, that's the one. If God did that, then yes, that's a different situation. But God doesn't do that, in my opinion, today. God's not coming down and saying, you've got to be the one and calling this an anointed one. When God anointed one, he was literally saying, this is the one. They did the anointing, not just spiritually with the oil or whatever, and literally taking this person and, picking them up. And the other thing, too, you got to remember is this. If you look for a correlation between pastors today and the closest thing in the Old Testament, I always, as a matter of fact, Lifeway put out something a number of years ago. I was like, no! They said, the pastors of today are the same as the priests of the Old Testament.
What?
Matter of fact, also, when I first taught at Washington Bible College, the first class I taught, they said, what's your specialty? I said, New Testament, especially Pauline and Johannine epistles. It's good. They said, call me a day or two. Good, you're teaching Pentateuch. Okay, thank you. But when I taught Pentateuch, they had a prepackaged course to start with. I went to the dean. I said, Dr. Curtis, I can't teach this. He said, why? I said, because look at the first page. The first page says that the priests of the Old Testament are the pastors of today. He said, we don't believe that. I said, I know. The whole thing was filled with that kind of stuff. So he said, develop your own course, which I did. I love doing that. But the point is that the priests of the Old Testament, basically, what were they? Well, they were part-time butchers. They were for the animals. They were people who were taking care of the temple. They were people who were servicing God in that manner. The high priest would go into the Holy of Holies as well, and they sacrificed. But the job of a priest was a bloody job, okay? The closest thing in the Old Testament to what we have today as a pastor would have been the rabbi. The rabbi was not someone who was anointed by God. That was a teacher. And in your synagogue, you would have the rabbi. Now, it's still not an exact parallel there, but if you want to look for the closest we have, I think the rabbi would be the closest to the pastor of today. but not the priests. And so therefore, the one fake pastor, he was the one that said, don't touch God's anointed. Among others, I've heard they say that. And my first question to him is, are you claiming to be a king or a prophet of the Old Testament? Because those are the people that were anointed. So are you claiming to be an Israeli king or a prophet? He didn't have an answer for that one. But the point is that I think we've got to be careful. And the number one, Clint, you got to say something.
Oh, well, I'm just going to give an example in the history of our own church. We had a pastor one time who said, basically, you have to listen to me because I've been called to be the pastor.
Yes.
But then some of the folks in the congregation said, well, we've been called to be members of the church just as much as you've been called to be the pastor.
Right.
So
I agree completely.
we're not necessarily going to do everything you say.
As soon as you hear a pastor say, because I've been called, you have to do everything I say, that's my first thought to say, you are the wrong person and you are not going to say as a pastor of this church while I'm here.
Well, and he didn't.
And he didn't, exactly.
They're giving themselves authority when they do that.
Yes, I had the same thing. That's what originally triggered me to look up the guy's background for what happened when he came out and started doing not church discipline, but pastoral discipline. He literally went, all right, you're out of the church, type things like that. And that's like, no, that is not what the Bible teaches. So, agreed. Anytime when we're looking for a pastor, any guy who thinks he's getting this extra authority, that ain't the way to do it. And again, I actually turned down certain authorities when I was doing the teaching pastor to say, look, this is something that I can easily do and I'm glad to help in this area. But I don't have any biblical authority to do this. This needs to be done by the elders as a whole or something like that. Now let me go to two extremes here that we got to watch out for. Number one, the extreme which, you've seen where a guy thinks that he's king basically. He's been elected king, so therefore he gets to be in the pulpit. That's obviously wrong. There's no such thing as an anointed one here, and the story of Korah has no bearing whatsoever on the pastorate, other than to say, be faithful to God's word, maybe, okay? But there is no direct bearing between the story of Korah and a pastor, because Moses was specifically chosen by God. Pastors are not anointed to be that, okay? I should say not anointed to be that. I think I said ordained a minute ago, I meant anointed. But there is another extreme which I've also faced. And that is where the elders will say, or other people will say, well, we know this is the right thing to do, but we're not going to do it because it would be just too much political hassle in the church or whatever. I was in a church where there were two people in particular that had to have pastor church discipline, period. Had to have it. And the elders, everyone said, you're absolutely right, they have to be disciplined, but we're not going to do it. And the reason was because it would have been a bad optic for the church. When you've got a member who is telling falsehoods can't go 4 minutes without telling falsehoods, who is a charismatic and who is literally handing out letters in the parking lot to people to say how slimy two of the elders are, okay, when they're total falsehoods, okay, that's the time for church discipline, among other things. I'm a big believer that church discipline should be rare. But when it happens, it has to be something where it's affecting the reputation of the church, and when you do it, you have to do it. It's not optional either. And that was a good case where it should have been done. And basically, you've got the two extremes. In many cases, things that happen, and remember, when someone is coming as a member of the church and doing something, they're representing the church. I know one other thing we ran into, and at least we were able to fix that one, was you can disagree with my opinion, once you get to the point of coming up here and preaching, teaching, playing the piano, singing in a choir, whatever, okay, you have to be a believer, period. If you're not a believer, because as soon as you do that, like it or not, people will see you as a representative of our church. We had a situation, for example, where the previous pastor hired an organist. Wasn't a believer, but hey, she could play the organ. My attitude is you're better off with just the piano and forgetting about the organ. And it turned out also Linda could play the organ, but didn't ask. But anyway, the point being is that you can't do something where you start putting believers to represent the church. And what happens is when you have someone flagrantly disobeying God, that's when you have the church discipline. So you can set them aside and say, look, we're not going to stop you from attending, but you can't be a member here, you can't vote here, you see what I'm saying? I'm not talking about shunning, but what I am saying is that there has to be limits, and both sides of the equation are wrong, and especially when they try to apply the situation of Korah. So we got to the end of verse 11. I think it's a good place to cut it. 12 and 13 go together. So next week, he'll be gone next week, sorry. Yeah, she's going to be gone for 2 weeks, by the way. She's going to Canada. I tried to stop her, but she said, no, better greener grass in Canada. So, no. No, she's going to visit her
warm
mom.
enough even in Canada.
Exactly, yeah. She's going to visit her mom in Canada. But, yeah, I won't have my editor here, my verbal editor.
I can send her a copy and she can.
That's true.
Some narration over the top.
Right, exactly, narrate over
You can
it.
zoom in, and just like-
No, I really do appreciate it when she says things like that, because sometimes I'll tell you this, one quick warning. If you ever hear me talking about like the three things that you're gonna find, or both of these things, okay, I am famous for, and not trying to, I am famous for holding up the wrong number of fingers. The voice will be right on that, but the fingers are gonna be wrong. The fingers are a random guess as far as what comes up, okay?
They're not important anyway.
They're not important, right, exactly. It's like one of the Stargate episodes when O'Neill did that. Two things, but anyway, the thing, but it's not intentional for me. The other thing that I mentioned before is, if you ever hear me talk about Moses getting on the ark with all the animals, sorry, I'm going to say that occasionally. I don't know why, it just sticks that way. I know the difference. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Hopefully we enjoyed this tonight. And as I said, the next two verses are going to go, they link right onto this. And they're actually kind of fun to go through. I think I'll go ahead and close in prayer tonight. Father, we thank you for who you are and what you've done for us. We thank you that you've given us your word, that we can not only study from it, but that it can change our life, that it can guide our church, and that we can look to you for the answers through your word. Father, I thank you for all of what you've done. I do ask that you would bless the people here, that you would give each one of us a Berean spirit where we want to dig into your word. I ask that you would bless our church, not just in numbers, but in spiritual growth, and that the numbers would follow from that. And I ask all this in Christ's name. Amen.
Mm-hmm.